Okay, welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just a second. We're on a tight schedule. They want us out of here at 3:45 to 3:50 to make way for the next program, so we'll try to get it in. Again, watch out. I'm going to start with introductions. Welcome to this session, conversations with Pauletta, Jeff, and Alan. I will do a brief introduction of myself and then introduce our guest with this order. My name is William Gwynn, and it's my honor and pleasure to host these wonderful poets before me. My background educationally is a master's degree from the University of Tennessee with a concentration in poetry writing. I've taught at Pauletta State Community College for about 25 years in composition and literature, as well as in Tusculum's Gateway program. But currently also, that was an adjunct faculty position. Currently though, and for a long time I've worked at Oak Ridge Public Library and in community relations, and I do programming and I liaise with the business, nonprofits, and arts community in Oak Ridge. That takes up a lot of my time too. Let's see, let me go ahead and dive into our guests. I've got Thomas Allen Holmes here. Thomas Allen Holmes spent many years on the staff and masthead of the Black Warrior Review while completing his graduate degrees at the University of Alabama. He is co-editor of Walking the Line, Music Lyricists and American Culture with Roxanne Hard, Lexington Books 2013. And Jeff Daniel Marion, Poet on the Holston with Jesse Graves and Ernest Lee, University of Tennessee Press 2015. And The Fire That Breaks, Gerard Manley Hawkins, Poetic Legacies with Daniel Westover, Clemson University Press 2020. His research and creative work have appeared in such journals as Louisiana Review, Valparaiso Poetry Review, the Connecticut Review, Appalachian Heritage, and Blue Mesa Review, Still, the Journal, and Appalachian Journal. Next, we have Jeff Hardin. Jeff is the author of 6 previous collections of poetry, most recently A Clearing Space in the Middle of Being, No Other Kind of World, and Small Revolution. His work has been honored with the Nicholas Roerich Prize, the Donald Justice Poetry Prize, and the H.J. Kennedy Prize. Originally from Savannah, Tennessee, he has taught for almost 3 decades at Columbia State Community College in Columbia, Tennessee. Pauletta Hansel. Pauletta is a poet, memoirist, teacher, and editor. She is the 2022 Writer in Residence for the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library. She served as the first Poet Laureate of Cincinnati from April 2016 through March 2018. Paula is the author of 9 poetry collections, and she leads community writing workshops and retreats in the greater Cincinnati area and beyond. She is a past managing editor of Pine Mountain, Sand and Gravel, the literary publication of the Southern Appalachian Writers Cooperative. So, welcome you guys, and welcome you guys. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to begin with, I'm going to have Pauletta read a poem titled Dirt, and I'd like to certainly center the discussion around poems as a touchstone for the themes that we'll work with, and we'll start with that.
Sounds great. So yes, this is working. I can tell, and I know it's useful in a nice room like this. Dirt. What people in town remember about my family's home was the dirt in the fenced front yard where no grass could stay grown, worn down by the feet of the kids Mom kept in the daycare where I worked too the summer I was 15, in my shorts and tank top, sitting out on the rock wall that bisected the dirt of the yard from the dirt of the driveway. Once, An old woman driving stopped. I don't know how old is old. Maybe the old I am now, older than dirt. Carved crevices around her mouth to tell me she once had a waist like mine, steep sloping down, though her ass set up higher. I've been thinking about dirt, or maybe the rock along the road I never noticed I noticed growing up there, sandstone and shells striated with coal that always looked wet, even in summer, grass a paler brown than the dirt, which, depending on where in the county you were, might be a gravelly, sandy, stony, silty loam. Maybe she said buttocks. Probably she said butt. I didn't know what to say to her. I had nothing to say. On the road out of town, Kentucky 15 to the Parkway, to the highway, an hour to there, and you're almost to Lexington, where there's something to do, not sit surrounded by kids and old and dirt, rough, broken, mountainous, deeply dissected. I didn't know that I knew how the farther you got up the road, the coal is gone. There's clay in the rock, and the grass is greener. I mean, really, it is on the other side.
Thank you. You know, when I read this poem, I don't know if you've ever read Alice Walker's Everyday Use, but I believe in the beginning of that short story, it reminds me of the front yard which you're talking about. They sweep the front yard every day, and actually it's an extension of their house. It's kind of like a living room, you know, in the summertime. A lot of times we see dirt and with imagery that's rather generative, you know, you grow a garden with it. But in this poem, how would you describe your reflection on that as a symbol in this poem?
Well, the poem started when I was noticing, as I was leaving Breathitt County, Kentucky, which is where this is from. I was, during the time I was writing the poems that became part of this book, I was doing a series of writing workshops in my old high school. So it was I was already sort of like living in an echo chamber. But I noticed as I was leaving, driving, you know, the road out of town, I just started paying attention to dirt and, you know, what it looked like. I mean, if you've ever been in Eastern Kentucky or East Tennessee or Southwest Virginia, you know, in order to make the roads, they have to carve a big slice out of the mountains. And so I just started paying attention to that dirt and began to then do a little bit of research about, well, what kind of dirt was there in Breathitt County versus Wolfe County versus, you know, whatever the counties on the way out. And it brought me, you know, the poem. And the image of you know, the dirt in my mom's daycare front yard was one that was always with me. But basically it was just following, you know, so following sort of my train of thought and following a little bit of the research too, to actually start putting names to things that I never noticed I noticed growing up there.
Okay. Yeah, I love how you say the grass really is greener on the other side. Another thing that came up was the encounter with the old lady whose mouth had the crevices. Is that she was making a scowl or a frown right before she delivered the line that was a half compliment, half insult? We call that a microaggression.
Well, I think she just wanted me to know, you know, for whatever reason. And of course now I am probably about the same age that she is now. And sometimes I want girls to know too that was, you know, that I am still that person inside. So I think that was part of it, that she just wanted me to know, and it's like, well, all right then. It didn't mean much to me then, but obviously it meant enough to be able to hold on to it and to bring it back as kind of a full circle reflection of what it meant to be a woman and a girl in that particular place and time.
Yeah, following up on that, I know in another one of your poems that deals with patterns that your mother used to sew for you.
Yeah.
And there's an image in there where you said something like the only time the kitchen table was a mess was when she was creating the pattern for a dress, right?
When she was creating the dress.
And, the idea of adolescence and growing up as a woman, she customizes that dress to put 2 seams in, apparently for lifting purposes, and you say in a beautifully enjambed line that it just wasn't there yet, or something like that, right? Yeah. And what was your experience of adolescence, and we're so aware of body shaming these days, or these ideas that are culturally handed down about bodies. How did that feel?
Well, you know, I think, and that the other thing that is sort of moving through that poem is that my mother was able to sew everything for us much better than what we could buy in the store. But of course, we wanted store-bought because that's, you know, that's what daughters want, what girls want. And I think that's part of, you know, part of that that question of growing up female in a place. You know, it's complicated by place and time, but there is a way in which it's not okay to be different, to stand out. That you want to stand out and be different, but you don't want to. You want to in your own particular way. So it's, you know, it's the whole issue of, I think, of body image, of body awareness is complicated by time and place, as well as by gender. And one of the things that I am aware of in writing the poems, and then in sort of putting the poems in a pattern, to use that word, but, you know, making something more than just individual poems, is that there's more than one lens through which to look at these girlhood issues, and place is one of those lenses, but I don't think it's the only lens within this particular manuscript, because the experience of being girl, I think, is true across generations and across geography as well.
Related to that, this is very close, I think, to that poem when you talk about looking back to that place and time. So, Letter to Myself, 15. Pauletta, if you wouldn't mind reading that.
Do you have the page number?
Page 35.
Thank you. there are 2 interlocked sequences running throughout this book. There's a bunch of poems called Story, and there's a bunch of poems called Letter to Myself 15, and so the page number is important. So this is the series Letter to Myself 15, which each of them begin with an epigraph from Henri Michaud's poem, I Am Writing to You from a Far Off Country. That far off country, of course, serving as a sort of metaphor for time. And this particular poem, the epigraph is, You can't imagine everything that's in the sky. Letter to Myself 15. All day has been about the weather and you. This morning's snowfall thought itself more than it was, soft down to bristled gray by noon, then sun and blue, then not. It's not as if this is a metaphor for us, though you, who once I was, are silk tailored to the bone, and I, who you become, will lie in bed some mornings trying to remember when it was my body loosened from itself, counting the folds. Here is what I want you to know. Most days, today, I think myself more beautiful than you ever did. You would not believe the way I dance, my husband's hand against the bone the wing would unfold from, should I ever decide to fly.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Alan now. Alan, I wonder if you could read The Knife for us.
Oh, sure.
On page 58. Alan is segueing into the reason I liked this poem, and for one thing, it's got a case knife in it, you know, and I love pocket knives. They're very useful, right? I think one time I had a microaggression put against me with someone. A woman said, "Do you have a knife?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, either you've got one or you don't." And I think after that, I went out and got one eventually. I did get a case knife. That's one of the beauties of over there near Sevier County, right? You have that fancy knife store. And so that reminded me of your poem, Alan. Good to do with the honor.
Knife. I bought a bone-handled Stockman case, a green dye in the bone I hadn't seen. I knew it wouldn't be for show. He'd put it through rough work, to pry a rusted-shut machine, to slice an apple swiped on pants, to clean, to strip a wire, to shape the tire patch goo and striate rubber too, and twist a screw when thumbnails wouldn't do. It could have been a Sunday knife, a precious thing. But he knew what a knife was for and showed his pride by making it do everything. Why be reluctant? Take it. Let it slip inside my pocket with his year's utility kept folded in it ever since he's died.
Okay, thank you. Alan, when I think of this knife, you know, you've got kind of the smallish size case knives, and then you've got kind of that medium heavy duty size. Which one do you recall?
Oh, it's the size of an index finger.
Okay, yeah, about that nice size that's really helpful. And I wondered, was the tip broken off of that knife or not?
You mean the real knife?
Yeah.
Okay. The real knife, the situation is my father was going through dementia, and it was frequently the case when he thought he was fixing things when he was actually destroying them. So he managed to just completely annihilate the blades in that case knife. And if you own a case knife, you know that the company will repair a knife for free. You know, you send it back to them, you send a handling fee to it, and then they'll repair it. And so for a while, I wrestled with the idea of whether to get new blades for that knife, and I decided just to keep it the way it is. And so I've got it in a drawer at the house. I don't carry it with me. I carry my own. So there is a real knife. In this case, the actual and the true are pretty aligned in this poem. But it's not always like that.
Yeah, I was brought back to, again, everyday use. You know, the issue there is this quilt, you know, when one of the sisters comes home, she's been college educated, and she just sees that quilt, she just wants it for an object, a treasure to hang on the wall. And of course, the mother says, this quilt's for everyday use. You know, your sister, she could make another one if she needed it. So you think about that with a beautiful knife too. You know, should I do this job with this knife or not? Now, turning a little bit, you have a cycle of poems towards the back, the Thomas Crofts poems. And I just wondered if you could read one of those, the one about the computer that catches on fire.
Thomas Crofts has a computer problem and I start a fire in his office. When I was passing through the second floor, Herr Dr. Thomas Crofts, medievalist, delayed me with a question. Why? He asked, and I, due stumped, decided we should sit. I offered to step up to my drear cell and grab my instrument of solace, mandolin, while he could noodle through a banjo tune, when all at once the power grid shut down. And then the students all began to act as if they'd never seen the dark. I nearly shouted to them there were windows in the classrooms, but in such a situation, hope is lost. Then Thomas said, let's lead benighted souls into the light. He grabbed a student newspaper from off his desk and rolled it pretty tight. I lit it up, completely unaware of Big Mac coupons, flammable as gas in my new torch. We smoked 6 ceiling tiles in just an instant, dropped the fire into a rubbish can, and nudged it to the hall. The students ranged around the fire like Christmas vagrants, stuck in Bristol for the holiday, afraid to cross state lines. And I began to sing beneath my breath of Molly Bond, and Thomas got his banjo, and the hall soon filled with senior faculty who kept their flasks stuck in their desks. Oh, strange new world, one of them said, and kissed my forehead hard.
I will have to say that I noticed that the author's gift bags down there in the special author's room do have a small bottle of Jack Daniels with them. And
They do?
You guys do.
There's extras down there.
Oh. Sometimes it helps to bring these things up.
Okay.
I said, did that really happen when I read that poem? And what did you say?
I like the idea that people believe it happened.
I believe it was happened in your head.
I need badges that say I believe in Thomas Crofts.
Thank you, Alan. Next, we're going to look at a couple of selections from Jeff. And these are just all lovely poems, Jeff. It's hard to know where to dive in, but how about If Design Govern? I think it's on 43.
Of course, that's an echo of a Robert Frost poem, right? Design. So if design govern, and then all of these poems use what I call a watermark phrase. So there's a visible and vertical 5-word phrase down the margin. So you go from the title, if design govern, in a thing so small. And then I stitch my ideas back through these words. If design govern, in due time perhaps we get a glimpse that all we know or can know is as a tumbling leaf the wind snatches elsewhere, bringing forth a dust that can't be reassembled. Even our metaphors, to show the shallowness of thinking, can't rise above mundanity, the much diminished thing we try to make much of. We venture on across the wide and wider spaces. The gaps fill in with deeper gaps, and all our words suggest more words, more words. So many they may, in fact, fill a universe, itself continually expanding. Words, syllables, phonemes, each a universe singing across the space of itself, yet strangely spoken by us, small as we are, and almost nothing, really. A sliver of width, a synapse, a slowness, in the length of all time, barely a breath, yet all that exists that can lift words out of a self.
Okay. Yes, this is beautiful. You say that sometimes even our metaphors to show shallowness of thinking, and I started thinking about that, and it's true, isn't it, that sometimes a metaphor is a bit of a lazy thinker, right? It's kind of, there's a level or two beneath that that we can go to. And the last line, yet all that exists that can lift words out of a self. And let me just have you read another poem. For when the days seem absent, any answers? 29.
This uses Martin Luther King's statement, no lie can live forever. For when the days seem absent, any answers? No is sometimes the affirmation a soul most needs. A mountain brought to its knees before a valley, stretching miles ahead. Idea so vast the mind cannot contain it. Signs and wonders lie everywhere around us. Like the morning I saw a parking lot puddle filled with birds, 100 frolicking and cleansing themselves, rejoicing, I'm tempted to say. In that way, a person can discern without a single doubt a message has been given. For I'll admit that I believe, have always believed, such moments seek us out to show us what's unseen within the life we live. So I received it, spoke yes aloud, while sailing over roads and in and out of neighborhoods, sang it, really, over and over, out of tune, I'm sure, though wide awake inside forever, if that's conceivable, and even if it's not. You should have seen me, to the ends of my existence, doing my own cleansed dance, feeling all around me that cool water's truth.
Okay, I'm going to wear you out and ask you to read one more poem. Get warmed up. A fine distinction on page 25.
All right, so this uses Emily Dickinson. Faith is a fine invention. Fine distinction. Faith, what are you exactly? Part wish, part desire, part hope to believe, part asking the next thought to empty itself. I don't ask not believing, just not knowing. Is my asking a way to get closer or farther from wandering your wide rooms? Yes, I know, evidence of things not seen, yet being words, thus imprecise. A phrase is only a small light aimed ahead, though the walk is long, dark and deep, as one man said, and perhaps along a ledge without assistance. Some, content that we infuse all words with fine distinctions we invent to make ourselves feel safe, seem not to worry if an error has been made. Is something overlooked? I doubt this thrust to know what can't be known is my invention. For if it were, I'd let it go, do something mindless, catch falling leaves, for instance, and toss them back into the trees, over and over, till I could feel their shade again.
Thank you. Jeff, you asked in the first stanza, you said, I don't ask not believing, just not knowing. How would you explain that?
Oh, I don't know. Well, I mean, this is my 7th book, and so I think a lot of my books, or all of my poems, in some ways deal with the issue of faith, and deal with the issue of belief. And, but I'm also, as all of us are, very rational about things. And so I believe, but very often I don't know. And there seems to be a conflict between those two parts of myself. So a line like that comes and it kind of takes me off guard when I wrote it. I remember that.
Would you say that your poetry attempts to bridge that gap between reason and belief in a way?
Yeah, knowing and not knowing. That to me is kind of there's a dialectic, I guess, that's always at work in my thinking. There's somewhere in a poem I wrote, I had read that we know like 3% of the universe. Well, how did you calculate that? How is that possible?
You just have to believe it.
Yeah.
It's 2.5.
Yeah. And then I'm thinking, well, I read that, which is a form of desiring to know, right? When you read, you're wanting to know. You're not exactly content with what you already know. There must be something else, and there is. And once you find that, there must be something else. But if the universe, or maybe John can tell us whether we know literally 3% of all that. So even if you knew 100% of the 3%, you still wouldn't know anything.
It's like the origin of God. Once you know where he's from or it's from, it's like, where did it come from? Blah, 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 blah.
Okay, and finally, words, really. I sense in a lot of the poems that I read from you, this kind of tension between the power of words and the impotence of words sometimes. And, you know, can you speak a little bit more about that dialectic in poetry?
Well,
and what that means as a poet?
Yeah. Actually, I had written something, I think, this morning about that. Maybe this will be my answer. Can I do that?
Yeah, sure.
This is my poem I wrote this morning at 5 a.m. Eternity. A room, a mind, an hour to be alone with nothing but the turning of a thought into the absence of itself, into the moment already gone, finning away into lightless depths. A mind is a room, a standing place to secure an uprightness against falling, against fallenness, to be made firm, set apart, to know what knowing is or isn't, to imagine the last person ever, how the wind sounds through the hush of the leaves, whether then there is anything left to say, even if no one will hear. Did anyone abide with words not their own anyway? A word is a room without walls, a world unto itself, for itself, of itself. A word is a mind seeking what it cannot find, a refrain of time inclining toward eternity, a weeping for being known, for what it doesn't know, what it cannot mend.
Dang.
Thank you. Good. Okay.
So can that be my answer?
Yeah, I think we'll take that. That's good. Let's have the Valley, Jones Valley one. You want to start from the beginning to
From the beginning.
Yeah.
Jones Valley. There was a walnut here, wind broke it. A cedar thrives now, offering meager shade for survivors too past lost to grieve. We count uncles and aunts, those here most at rest. We stay long enough to watch your cousins roll up plastic rugs from around the graves now. You pull a rose from a spray and toss it onto her casket. From this hillside, we see fields fallow for years, overgrown, pastures forced empty by drought, winter feed cost, corporate farms unable to recognize any livestock dignity, respected by real farmers who know a beast's potential unpredictability and stand wary, set to jump out of the way, quick to grab a blunt horn or a harness, or to strike hard and stand firm. My family farmed here, left here for Indiana, returned here justice broke, homesick, sick of Yankees, sick of mockery from those only a generation more assimilated. It was better to walk past old home places lost to us, unmade crops, mortgages, so many sons gone to war, still up north, not coming back, having children who mock us for being backward, southern, country, when we are cautious, rooted, country without sneer, without derision or shame. I would like to go back and give your newlywed parents that $100 that would have saved that pasture. I would like to join those men waiting in the backhoe shadow. I can hear their radio turned down in respect, of course, but hinting of tackles and first downs. I would like to drive you to that spring on our old home place and squeeze green peppermint leaves and drink ice cold water until my jaws ache, as we ache, as my heart aches.
I was struck by the backhoe shadow in the scene of, I guess the workers, right? With the radios turned down.
Yeah, the grave diggers.
The grave diggers. And, you know, the tendency would be to be indignant at that moment, right? There's a funeral happening here, you know, be quiet. And this poem is just so welcoming to all life in that moment. It's just, you know, another thing that's appreciated.
I can't hear you when you whisper. If you can use the mic, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks, John. I was, if you could maybe talk about the backhoe shadow and how that's actually the title of your book in that moment when you found that poem, if it hit you like that.
I was thinking about that moment where there's something necessary that has to be taken care of, and that you realize that there have to be new steps. And so there's, I think in the poem, this situation of almost a kind of envy to see these professional people who are at a place who can take care of something and not have nearly the emotional engagement in that moment, while the speaker in the poem is going through a lot of the wrenching feelings about it. So that it's a moment of, I think, of envy on the part of the speaker to be able to have just a temporary detachment from the awareness of the transition from one way of life to another way of life. So, but I'm talking like an English professor now.
No, you're not.
You are one.
That's right.
Good job.
Thank you. We like that here. Pauletta, you had a poem, Blessing, and then with that poem we'll close and follow up with Q&A for like 5 minutes, and I want us to get out of here after that.
So I asked if I could read this poem because this is my late mother's 90th birthday. The Blessing, and it begins with a quote from a participant in a dementia caregiver workshop that I led. And the quote is, "If you're going to die, why don't you do it all at once and not this little bit of dying every day?" But Mother, it is that bit of you, that stuttering spark only those bent close enough can see, lighting the dark around the you I never would have known had death blazed full and hot and gone, no charred pieces left to quietly burn throughout our bundled days, the bellow of my breath against your skin. It's for Warnie Lewis Hansel.
Thank you, Pauletta. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes for questions. You would like to direct to him?
I'd just like to know how old each of you were when you read Night Comes to the Cumberlands. What was your age when you first read it?
I never did. I skimmed, but I heard enough about it to know that I didn't need to read it.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you.
I've got a question. I've got a question because I know what only about 3% of the people in here know. In that, I'm curious in how, and this is not about content directly, but I'm curious about your decisions about how the poems should look on the page. Because I noticed, for example, in Dirt, Pauletta, that you have some stanzas that are left justified, and you have some stanzas that are right justified, as if they're facing each other or dealing with each other. And Jeff has many poems that appear to drift in from the left margin towards the center of the page, and I'm curious about how you think about the visual impact of the poem and how you deal with the line breaks in such a way to emphasize the points that you want to make. So that's a typographical question, and you'll have to excuse me.
Yeah, and, you know, I can start since you talk about that poem, because in a way, I think with that particular poem, there are two different conversations going on, right? There's like there's the dirt, and then there's the story of the girl who I was and the old woman who I was becoming. But I think in a sense, I did play with how that laid out, and I think what I was really trying to do was to show something of the working of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't enough just to do a stanza break,
Yes.
you know, because I'd interrupted one thought and picked up another, and then interrupted that thought for another.
Counterpoint.
Yeah, and with the blessing, which is another one, is probably more sort of typographical, that the poem moves inward toward the last breath.
Yes.
Yeah. So sometimes, you know, sometimes it's pretty straightforward, and it's just a matter of, you know, how does this look? How will this read? How will it help the reader with the flow? And sometimes it's more of a visual poem.
And Jim?
Well, I write so many different kinds of poems. I've probably written a poem every day for the last 2 decades or something, but I find that the shape of a poem, I'll get into like what I think of as a kind of groove. There's a shape that I'll be doing for a while, and sometimes that while is 7 days in a row, and the next time it's, well, like my third book is a book of sonnets. I wrote most of that book in 2 months. I wrote a sonnet a day, 2007, and then, you know, unexpectedly, the next thing I wrote was entirely different, and I kind of went off in a different direction. Yesterday, one of my poems appeared in Cumberland River Review. It's called Taking Up the Cause of Gladness. And so I've written a ton of those types of poems, but there are 5 3-line stanzas, and each stanza is kind of like its own thing. And maybe the next one is intuitively connected, and I feel like it is. But I can write one of these 15-line poems tomorrow, 5 o'clock, if that's what I choose to do. I might start with that. But to me, a poem is like it's a container, and this container looks a little different than the one I wrote the day before, or the week before. Of course, this particular book is, you know, about 18 years ago I wrote. I told my friend Michelle Miller I was going to take lines out of failed poems and make them the titles of new poems. And then, so I wrote this line, how quiet must I be? When I wrote it on the page, I suddenly thought of it kind of like an XY axis, and I went, I wonder what would happen if I turned it like on its ear like this. And so I just spaced these words out and then began to stitch my ideas back through them. And then I just thought, well, you know, Rilke says you must change your life. So, oh, well, that's an interesting. And then I wrote down everything I could think of. You know, I had promises to keep. You know, practice losing farther, losing faster. And all of these echoes, like Shining from Shook Foyle, you know, Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I realized so many of the lines that are, especially from literature or even from the Bible, or from a band like U2, One Life with Each Other, you know, Better Learn How to Kneel. They're all 5 words. And so I made a list of, you know, probably 50 or 100 of them. And then over time I began, or really the next 4 to 5 years, I wrote most of this book that way. But it was, I had this whispered prayer behind the poem that I kept stitching my ideas back through. It was a way of honoring, too, those particular phrases or statements, these lines. You know, I've said this before, but you know, I'm an 8th generation descendant from the founder of Hardin County in Tennessee. But if you really want to find out who I am, then you find out the words that spoke me into existence. And Martin Luther King saying, "No lie can live forever." William Stafford, you know, he has lines all the time that, you know, I feel like I'm born out of those lines.
we have time for one more brief question.
I always like to ask people when they write and where they write, and what tools they use, and what creature comforts they require. I'm nosy like that. I just want to know when you do it, how you do it, what do you use? Do you write with pen and paper? Do you write in the morning? Do you need your chocolate milk? Someone famous, I can't remember, who had to have chocolate milk.
I'm pretty varied, actually. I mean, I teach a number of community classes, and I always try to offer sort of writing prompts and writing ideas that I need to be writing about. So sometimes it is in a circle of other writers. I have almost always, until the last couple of months, written first longhand and then moved it into the computer, relatively quickly, or not, kind of depending on the poem. But I'm working on a series of poems now, which are really kind of based on research, and I find myself often starting the poem on the computer, which is new for me. And they're very different poems than the poems that I write by hand, which may or may not be good. We'll find out and start letting people read them. But I find myself in a transition right now, but also it just depends on the circumstance.
That's a different answer for every decade of my life, I guess. But most of the last 15 years or so, I get up at 5 o'clock and make a pot of coffee and either sit in my sunroom or on one of my 3 porches if the weather is nice. And I typically have differently sized notebooks, sometimes small, sometimes big and wide, sometimes tall. Like the shape of the notebook, to me, dictates the shape of thought, That's been kind of my answer to that, I guess. But, coffee, and then I usually assemble around me. I have about 5,000 poetry books, and so I usually just kind of in the mornings, it's kind of a hodgepodge of things I might pick about 4 or 5 or 6 things, and just kind of gather them, and they're with me, kind of like, if I want some of Alan's, I want to go back and give that couple that $100, like I want that with me when I'm writing. I want that line with me, or whoever it is. I want something there that's kind of part of this larger community, because words for me were always incredibly private, and then they were always a part of a larger sanctuary, a congregation. And so my congregation, in many ways, is these other 5,000 books of friends and influences.
I want a legal pad with a back on it that's thick enough that it'll stand rigid if I hold it by the corner, and I want a vision involved elite. So that, because if I start composing on the computer, I will start copy editing as soon as the first page. So it's better for me to write everything out longhand, draw a little sketch in the corner if I need to do it, think a minute, and count time, and then deal with whatever it is I have from that first construction goes on with that. But it's got to be a good, thick legal.
Morning, night.
Whenever people will leave me alone.
Yay.
I used to write stuff in the truck. No, I'd keep a legal pad in the truck while I was waiting for the kids to come out of school, because I'd have about 15 or 20 minutes right then, and I could start something. So there's at least 3 or 4 of those in here from that. But I steal time. I make time and I steal time. That's all I do.
Okay. I invite you all to follow us to the War Memorial Plaza, the signing colonnade next to Parnassus books, and stock up on these. Let's give our poets a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming.